Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle everything you thought you knew about building a high-performing executive team. So if you're exhausted by endless alignment meetings that somehow result in absolutely zero forward momentum, you are in the exact right place. We are going to map out the literal physics of execution. We'll draw on some deep organizational structural analysis to reveal exactly why great teams stall out and, more importantly, exactly how to fix it. Okay, let's dive right in.
Consider this incredibly counterintuitive puzzle for a second. Let's say your leadership team communicates perfectly. They're deeply empathetic, they possess incredible emotional intelligence, and they give each other masterful feedback. It sounds great, right? And yet, your core initiatives are completely stalled out. Why does this actually happen? Well, the common assumption is that execution fails because of poor communication or a lack of alignment. But what if that assumption is literally entirely wrong?
This brings us to a massively contrarian structural claim from our source material, and it directly contradicts conventional leadership advice. Over-indexing on things like psychological safety, consensus, and shared accountability, that's actually a structural toxin. It actively destroys execution velocity. A highly self-aware team is a wonderful thing to have, for sure, but insight is ultimately just a cognitive event. It doesn't actually produce execution. Structure produces execution.
To understand exactly why that is, we have to look at our first major failure mode, the accountability illusion. When you ask who owns a failing initiative and the answer you get is, "we all do," you are looking directly at a structural void where nobody is actually on the hook. Think about it. We don't lose sleep over stalled projects. We don't suffer consequences. Mistaking collective alignment for execution is an absolute illusion. It feels wonderful, but it produces total organizational paralysis.
And this draws a brilliant, non-obvious distinction between shared and singular accountability. Shared accountability fosters endless debate. It safely distributes the blame so no single person ever really feels the heat. Singular accountability, on the other hand, creates binary clarity. It concentrates the burden. When you try to co-own an initiative, you haven't actually delegated the outcome, you've merely delegated the debate.
Now, the mechanical reality behind this failure mode is explicitly known as multi-owner dilution. You just cannot be partially accountable for an outcome. The causal mechanism here is astonishingly simple. Splitting the burden completely eliminates the anxiety required to drive action. If multiple leaders co-own a project, each one naturally assumes the other is going to push it over the finish line. So the pressure required to actually finalize the work, it just dilutes to zero.
Let's look at how this builds into a very specific causal mechanism we call the silent veto. Because shared ownership requires implicit unanimous consent, a single leader can indefinitely stall an initiative without ever having to explicitly say no. They might just ask for more data or suggest they need to socialize the idea a little further. The initiative just dies through evaporation rather than confrontation. And that is the silent veto in action.
So, how do you know if you're suffering from multi-owner delusion versus, say, just a simple lack of resources? Well, the crucial point here is learning exactly how to spot this specific pathology in your own boardroom before it completely paralyzes your organization's momentum.
You need to look closely for these precise symptoms. Do you have chronic at-risk initiatives that just sit there, status meeting after status meeting? Do those meetings end with vague next steps instead of a specific named owner? Are people constantly approval chasing? If you're observing these symptoms holding true during your syncs, you don't have a collaboration problem. You are suffering from inadequate authority. This leads us right to our next non-obvious distinction, the enforcement gap. This beautifully explains the causal mechanism of why executive coaching focused purely on interpersonal dynamics consistently fails to change behavior. Leaders leave those sessions with deep intellectual insight, right? But because there are absolutely no structural penalties for reverting to old habits, the status quo always wins. Without enforcement, changing behavior is really just volunteering for discomfort. You know, executive coaching often teaches you to optimize for influence. But influence relies entirely on persuasion, which fundamentally makes compliance optional, and that completely collapses as an organization scales up. Influence without hard, system-driven authority is really just noise. It creates an environment where your strategic directives are treated merely as starting points for negotiation by your team.
This sequence perfectly maps out the failure of empowerment rhetoric. A coach tells a leader to prioritize psychological safety, so the leader abandons their authority for influence. The team then realizes that directives are really just suggestions. And then, the enforcement gap just swallows the strategy whole. Total empowerment without defined enforceable constraints is not leadership. It is literally anarchy.
Section Separating Input from Ownership.
Okay, to fix this organizational paralysis, we have to break apart the messy, ambiguous concept of collaboration into distinct, highly mechanical roles. The core of this fix is establishing what we call the pen. Singular ownership is the absolute, non-transferable right to make the final binding decision. If an initiative fails, the failure belongs exclusively to the person holding the pen. This completely eliminates the ambiguity of distributed blame. One name is on the line, period.
Consider this breakdown your new operating manual, and you'll want to memorize these distinctions. Input is just context. It's a voice, but it's not a vote, and the owner can completely ignore it. Ownership is the pen. It's singular, and it carries all the consequence. And approval is strictly a constraint check. Think of it like a legal boundary or a budget ceiling. Approvers do not get to rewrite the strategy. They only guard the gate. So here is a concrete conditional decision rule you can apply. If this observable condition holds, an initiative remains marked at risk without a shipped milestone across multiple meetings, then you must act. Immediately remove all shared ownership language from the project and assign a singular penholder with strict constraint-based approvals. Do this instantly the moment you see the silent veto mechanism slowing down your teams.
However, assigning singular ownership is really only half the battle. Once you establish singular owners, you actually have to control when they make decisions. We call this governance cadence. Think of it as the structural containment for your strategy, because if you don't control the rhythm of decision-making, the daily operational noise is going to completely control you.
Now, here's a really non-obvious distinction between activity and cadence. A calendar packed full of urgent, quick touch bases and ad hoc syncs, that's high activity. It's reactive, it's anxiety-driven, and it leads to what we call decision snacking in the hallways. Cadence, on the other hand, is predictive. It forces decisions to be batched and processed through a structural temporal architecture. Basically, high activity actually represents zero governance cadence.
Let's look at exactly how to build this structural dam against operational chaos. First, establish a rigid meeting purely for cross-functional trade-offs. Second, completely ban strategic decisions from happening in unstructured channels like instant messaging. Third, require a structured memo just to get on the meeting agenda. By forcing the organization to batch its anxiety and process it strictly through this turbine, you will instantly restore execution velocity.
Which brings us to our next concrete decision rule. If executives constantly use ad hoc messages to unblock routine work, then refuse to make the decision in that moment, and instead force the request into a standardized memo for your designated governance forum. You've got to apply this rule relentlessly. It forces you to be rigid about the when so that your organization can actually be flexible about the what. This entire framework boils down to a pretty hard truth from our source material. Accountability is a completely unnatural state for human organizations. Left to their own devices, groups will always drift toward ambiguity and shared blame. Therefore, accountability has to be engineered and maintained with absolute, unapologetic structural force. Authority is not given to you, it is exercised. And if you do not exercise it, you simply do not have it.
I want you to look closely at your own execution architecture today and ask yourself this final question. Are you running a high-velocity business, or have you accidentally built a highly self-aware philosophy department? Insight without consequence is just trivia. Insight is cheap, but a lack of structural execution will ultimately cost you everything. So build the structure, assign the pen, and enforce the cadence. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.